They said the mangroves could swallow a man without leaving a ripple. On Ramree Island in early 1945, where the tide slides through roots like a thief, and the air is sweet with rot, men learned how true that felt. British and Indian forces came for the airfield and a foothold on Burma's coast. The Japanese garrison vowed to hold both or die. For days they fought among palms, revetments, and salt creeks that smelled of brine and mud, until artillery began to walk the island like iron rain, and the garrison broke. At first, the war looked disciplined. Naval guns paced the horizon. Aircraft punched neat holes in the afternoon. Infantry moved by the map, mile by mile, through scrub and paddy. But order breaks at the edge of a mangrove. What looks flat on paper becomes a maze, pools pretending to be ground, tunnels roofed with roots, and narrow cuts where the tide runs like a river. The British said, "Take the road north." The Japanese said, "Slip through the swamp." The swamp said, "Choose quickly." A blockade closed the western shore. The eastern shallows flared with tracer at night. The airfield's batteries fell silent one by one. Low on food and water, burdened with wounded, the garrison packed what ammunition it could carry and filed into the mangroves. Dusk hides shame, and no officer wants to be seen retreating. Lanterns were useless. Light bounced off the wet air and showed a man only his own breath. Roots curled like traps. The mud was a liar, firm until it swallowed a boot. Saltwater crocodiles live like stones until meat moves. Old fishermen along the coast said a big one will wait at a creek mouth with only its eyes above the film, then choose the second man who crosses instead of the first. Whether that is true or a knife-edge joke, no one in that swamp argued long. There were crocodiles in those channels, and there were men in the water, and the new rule became simple: do not fall. A man who went under might surface once to shout and never surface again. The first screams after dark did not belong to crocodiles. They were the voice of wounds, the rifle fired blind in panic, the soldier who stepped in a hole and bayoneted a shadow. Then the noises changed, splashes with weight, a thrash like canvas dragged along a hull. The sound a man makes when breath is forced out of him at once, followed by a gulp and water closing. A flare hung and failed. For a heartbeat, a whole channel turned silver, stitched with ripples that did not come from wind. Accounts disagree, as they do when fear is the stenographer. Some British and Indian soldiers later wrote that the swamp became a charnel house, crocodiles moving like iron logs, and that by dawn the channels were quiet because there was nothing left to make noise. Others, cooler or perhaps closer to the truth, say disease, thirst, and wounds killed most, that crocodiles took some but not scores, that the swamp was indifferent rather than ravenous. Numbers on Ramree refused to stay still. When the swamp took over, even officers lost the ability to count. A platoon that entered with 30 rifles emerged with 12, half of them coughing brackish water and shaking with fever. Bodies were impossible to recover. The tide lifted them, set them down, and took them again. Some washed into grass and lay where air and insects finished the work. Others, if the fishermen's stories are right, never saw the sky after the first plunge. In the morning, crabs stitched their small handwriting in mud. People like numbers. They like to say, this many died of bullets, this many of crocodiles, this many simply sat down and never rose. Ramree will not give you a figure you can trust. After the war, a famous page called it the worst crocodile disaster in recorded history, and the phrase stuck like a burr. Later historians traced the paperwork and said not so fast. The retreat was catastrophic, but crocodiles were only one of several enemies. What the witnesses agree on are the senses. The swamp smelled of sweet rot and cordite. Mosquitoes arrived in black veils. Mud pulled at boots and kept what it stole. Rifles jammed with grit that felt like ground shell. Somewhere near, always but never seen, An eye like a button slid along a seam of water and then sank. Men who had marched through jungles and up beaches without complaint learned on Ramree that stillness can be a weapon sharper than any blade. At certain hours, the tide ran with a mind of its own. It pushed men toward a bend where the roots were thicker and the water blacker, and the exit a trick. The retreating column broke and broke again. Officers tried to count by voices. First squad? Second? Answer if you can. A corporal gripped a sapling and watched bubbles rise in a pattern that meant nothing and everything. A private put his sling in his teeth and hauled a friend free of suction, while something heavy brushed his hip and kept going. There were rescues, and they mattered to the men who made them. A British patrol dragged 2 wounded Japanese out by the collars, hands hooked over roots, slick as fish. An Indian havildar jammed his bayonet into the mud as a stake and passed a rope down the file. 3 men who had stepped too far found the line and lived. A Burmese boatman drifted silent as a heron and took on any man who could lift a hand above the reeds. Mercy did not ask for uniforms, neither did mud. When dawn opened the mangroves, there was no chorus. That may be the truest account of all. Survivors on firm ground spoke softly or not at all. Some described shapes sliding under the water. Others remembered only the smell and how their legs trembled when the earth felt like floor again. One called it a place where night wore teeth. Another said he could not tell where swamp ended and ocean began, only that both were against him and that the silence afterward felt heavier than noise. The island fell. The airfield changed hands. A few stragglers fought on in pockets until their ammunition or bodies gave out. In the days that followed, scouts walked the swamp's edge and saw what the tide chose to show: rifles like driftwood, helmets like bowls turned upside down by a careless cook, and scoured vacancies where something powerful had moved and left no proof it had been there. If crocodiles feasted, they digested their evidence in the privacy of water. Still, the story stayed. It stayed because it sounded like a fable that might be true. An army beaten first by guns and then by a swamp that eats. It stayed because it fits something men already believe about the sea and its dark cousins, the creeks and mangroves. They care nothing for books or borders. They do not bargain. They only wait. In the years after the war, the tale of the Night of the Crocodiles traveled farther than the island, collecting details the way roots gather flotsam on a spring tide. Stand on a brackish channel at dusk and listen. You may hear only insects and the cough of a far engine, but if the water at your feet is dark enough, you will think about eyes under it. You will remember the notion that a crocodile chooses the second man, not the first. You will wonder, against better judgment, whether a place can learn the habits of slaughter because it has been well fed. And you will understand why men spoke in low voices afterward, even years later, with dry boots and safe roofs. War is a ledger written in more than numbers. Ramree's entry does not balance. It never will. The witnesses disagree. The historians argue. The mangroves say nothing. But there was a night when the boundary between enemy and environment blurred, when salt water, teeth, fever, and darkness worked together like an army that needed no orders. Call it legend if you wish. Call it caution. Call it the Night of the Crocodiles, and mean both the beasts and the hours when the tide turned and the retreat became ruin. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories of the world at war.